Hi, I'm Sydney, and the topic that I picked for the discussion and debate is about language change. So, kind of the big question that we want to answer regarding language change is, should we strive to preserve traditional language forms, or should language evolve naturally over time without interference? So, an example I picked to kind of introduce to the topic of language change is English, just because we all speak English and that's a common language between us. So we can look at the different versions of English over time. So the first version of English was Old English. This started in the year 450 and lasted till about 1066. And this version of English was spoken by Anglo-Saxons in England. Then this version of English kind of evolved into Middle English. That was from the year 1066 to 1500, and it was borrowed heavily from the French after the Norman conquest. So we can draw some similarities between Middle English and French. Then this evolved into early modern English. So this is when it starts to get similar to the version of English that we speak today. And this was from about 1500 to 1700 AD. And this is when English began to emerge as a more global language. And then modern English, that's the version of English that we speak today. That started in about 1700. And as we can see today, present day English is still continuing to evolve with the use of new terms and new styles of English language. So I have this example of Old English. I have this Google form with some questions. So we can pause the recording here and you can answer the first two questions. So try to guess what the Old English text says, and do you recognize any modern English words in the text? So we can pause the recording here and you can have some time to answer those questions. So this Old English text, I have a modern English translation. And this text is actually an excerpt from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And this was just like a historical telling about the early England and the Anglo-Saxon time period. And this translation is just about a historical event that includes the passing of King Edward. So some observations we can make. If we go back up to the Old English, we see that there are some characters that are no longer used in English anymore, such as this character here and this character here. There's also some words that are still used in modern English and have the same translation and meaning. So such as the word and, to, in, and on. They were all used in the Old English example, and they directly translate to modern English as well. But there were some words that look like modern English words but have different meanings. So rice, used in Old English, they're not talking about the food race. And her in Old English isn't the pronoun her, but it's the word here in modern English. So if we go back to the example, we can see that even proper names, which are names and places, can be different in Old English. So here Edward is spelled differently in Old English, and so is England. But we can see that some are the same. So Harold, that's something that stays the same in Old English and directly translate to modern English. There are some important documents that were written in Old English. So Beowulf, that's an epic poem that's considered the most important work of Old English literature. We have the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. That was the excerpt that I just showed. It's an important source for the history of England during the Anglo-Saxon period. And we have another account, History of the English People, which is a detailed account of early history in England. And that includes the conversion of Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. And I included the Alfred jewel. That's not like a traditional text, but it's a 17th century, like a physical jewel, which was commissioned by King Alfred the Great as a symbol of his educational reforms. And there's some text that's inscribed in Old English on the jewel, which is why I included that. So if we go back to the Google form, we can pick one of these Old English texts and try to explain what value the text provides to modern society. So we can have some time to answer that question and pause the recording here. So to answer the question, I think that all of these texts provide value to current society because it gives us a lot of insight into history of how the world used to be. And without the understanding of Old English, some things may be lost in translation, and it may be kind of hard to truly decipher the value that these texts bring. So another point is that there are some dead languages, which the term dead language we can use as a term that explains languages that are no longer in use as either spoken or written language. So some examples of dead languages and important documents written in them. We have Latin, which Julius Caesar's commentary on the Gallic War, the works of Cicero, and the Bible were all originally written in Latin. We have ancient Greek, which are the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Homer's epic poems. We have Sanskrit, which are the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and the works of Kalidasa were all written in this language. And we have Egyptian hieroglyphs, which a book called the Book of the Dead was written in this, and so was the Rosetta Stone. That was originally written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. So these examples can kind of bring us to the argument, which my argument is that we should strive to preserve traditional language forms. So as we can see, looking at the example of Old English and dead languages, there are a lot of important texts that historians can use if they understand these languages to draw insight from them. So the first point that I want to make is that language is tied to cultural identity and heritage. So language is an integral part of a community's culture and identity, and it can shape the way that people view the world around them. So it's important to keep these languages alive because they symbolize cultural heritage. Language can also be used to express cultural values, beliefs, and traditions, and it can also help maintain a sense of pride and belonging among the speakers of the language. So when a language is lost or endangered, a significant part of a community's cultural heritage is also lost with the language, along with perspectives and knowledge that the language can embody. Preserving traditional language forms can also help maintain cultural diversity and present the homogenization of language and culture around the world. So if we don't interfere, the languages could all die, and it can take a lot of cultural diversity away with it. So an example of this is preserving indigenous languages in the Americas. So these indigenous languages are often tied to cultural practices and rituals. So preserving these languages is very important for maintaining the cultural heritage of these communities. A source I found on this is called Why We Need to Preserve Indigenous Languages from National Geographic. And then a discussion question. So these discussion questions we can just leave till the end as like reflection questions just to save time. So a question that we can answer is, what role does language play in maintaining cultural identity and heritage? So the next point is about linguistic diversity. So preserving traditional language forms can contribute to linguistic diversity. So preserving traditional language forms helps maintain linguistic diversity, which is very important for promoting global understanding and cultural exchange. Another point is that each language represents a unique way of viewing and understanding the world. So if we lose a language, that means losing that perspective and knowledge. Language loss can also have negative effects on the community's social, economic, and political status. So that means that they may struggle to communicate with other groups or participate in wider society. If the language is lost, they lose a lot of that communication skills. So an example of this is the importance of preserving endangered languages in Africa. So for example, in Africa, many languages are endangered due to colonialism and globalization. So preserving these languages can help maintain the diversity of the continent's cultural and linguistic landscape. So an interesting source I found on this was called The World's Vanishing Languages from National Geographic. And it just gives like a better account of the importance of preserving endangered languages in Africa. So something we can discuss on this topic is, why is linguistic diversity important, and how does it contribute to society as a whole? Another point we can make is about historical records and literature. So kind of going off of the example that we discussed earlier, language is tied to historical records and literature. So we know that language is an important tool for preserving historical records and literature, and it's often the medium through which these texts are transmitted and understood. So for example, if a language dies, then it may be harder to translate these texts and really understand what they mean and what value they can bring. We also know that many important historical records and literary works have been written in languages that are no longer commonly spoken or understood, such as Latin or ancient Greek. So these are dead languages. So when these historical records are written in dead languages, it's hard to find someone to be able to translate it to understand what these texts mean. So studying these languages is also crucial for understanding the historical context and cultural significance of these works, as well as preserving them for future generations. So for example, even though we have the translations of some texts now, in future generations, we may lose these translations and it'll be harder for future generations to understand these languages. Preserving traditional language forms can also help ensure that modern works can be accurately translated and understood in their original context. And then an example I have of this topic is the importance of preserving classical languages. So this is our Latin and Greek. So these are still important for understanding today's foundations of culture and literature, because the foundations of this was all written in Latin and Greek. A source I found was from the UC Irvine Classic Department, and it's called "Why Do We Still Teach the Classics?" And it just explains the importance of preserving these classical languages. So a discussion question on this topic that we can think about is, how does preserving historical languages and literature help us better understand our past and shape our future? Another point is that language can create a sense of belonging and pride among speakers. So language is often used to express and reinforce a sense of cultural identity and pride among speakers, and it can help create a sense of belonging within a community. Language can also be a marker of social status or cultural affiliation, and speaking a traditional language can help individuals feel connected to their roots and their heritage. Losing a language can lead to feelings of cultural disconnection and erasure, and it can be detrimental to individuals' sense of self and belonging within a community. Preserving traditional language forms can help foster a sense of pride and connection to cultural heritage among speakers, as well as promoting cross-generational understanding and appreciation. So an example is preserving regional languages in Europe. So an example straight from the textbook is there was a sign that was written in Welsh, which Welsh is a dying language. So if the Welsh language dies and they all speak English, they may lose a sense of belonging and pride within their community. Another example is in Scotland. So Gaelic is spoken by a small community, and preserving the language is seen as crucial for maintaining the country's cultural identity and heritage. So a source I found on this was called "Can Foreign Speakers Help the Irish Language to Survive?" And this was an article published by BBC. So a question that we can think about on this topic is, how does language use contribute to one's sense of identity and belonging? Another point is that language can serve as a unifying force for a community or nation. So what we mean by this is language can serve as a means of communication and connection between people from different backgrounds, cultures, and regions. So this kind of gives them a unifying force, and it gives them the power to communicate between one another. We also know that a shared language can help break down barriers and promote understanding and empathy between groups that may otherwise have very little in common. So having the power of being able to communicate can really help different groups understand one another, and it can kind of get rid of some conflict. In some cases, having a shared language may even be necessary for effective communication and collaboration. So this is more applied to business, politics, or other fields that require international cooperation. We also know that preserving traditional language forms can help maintain a diverse linguistic landscape while also promoting mutual respect and understanding between speakers of different languages. So an example on this is the importance of preserving official languages in multilingual countries. So as we know, there was much debate on the city of Quebec. In Quebec, they wanted to get rid of Canadian as an official language. So an interesting source I found on this was a book called Language, Citizenship, and Identity in Quebec. And it just explains about how speaking French is very important to their culture, and how getting rid of this as an official language can have some pretty bad effects on Quebec. So a discussion question that we can think about is, how can language be used to bring people together and promote unity in a diverse society? So to summarize, my argument is that we should preserve traditional language forms, And the reasons for this is that it can provide a lot of cultural heritage, linguistic diversity. It gives us the power to read historical records and literature. It can help communities feel a sense of belonging and pride. And it can be a unifying force for communities that may otherwise not have much in common. And then here are some of my sources. And then on my Google form, we can have some time to answer these discussion questions that I discussed earlier. And the responses for this should all be anonymous. So that's about it for my presentation. Just to recap, my argument is that we should preserve traditional language forms.